right through the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. We got up to chapter 39 today, if you're following along. And actually, when you read 39 and you finish your time with Hezekiah, king of Judah, you kind of finish the first section of the book of Isaiah. And starting with chapter 40 through 66 is a kind of completely different section when it comes to the book of Isaiah. So that's tomorrow's reading, I know, but I wanted to jump on ahead of time. And the friends over at the Bible Project, they did a great video to help us kind of navigate this and to kind of see the shift that happens. And I just want to encourage you too, if you've been reading the first part of Isaiah, and probably the last few readings yesterday and today probably weren't too bad because it's kind of a little bit more of a narrative. There's a story going on, but sometimes when we get into the poetry with the judgment, the condemnation, and the way that Isaiah speaks, we kind of lose that in our translation and our culture when it comes into the English. So encourage you, if you feel like giving up on Isaiah, don't give up on him yet. In fact, when you get to chapter 40, you'll hear some familiar words we say that are connected, especially in the Advent season or around the Christmas season. Comfort ye my people, speaks your God. And so don't give up. Don't get too discouraged if you find yourself struggling at times. That's all right. And we kind of follow Luther on that and says when we get discouraged or when it gets too overwhelming, we're not going to just try to simply give up. We're just going to continue to praise God and move on, because sometimes His Word is higher than our thoughts and our ability to understand in the moment. But then other times when we're reading it, we're like, holy cow, or holy God, actually, probably would be better to say. You're talking right what I need to hear, right when I need to hear it. And maybe you've read it before, and only this time when you read it, it hits you right between the eyes with that word that goes out and accomplishes its purpose for you. So without further ado, let's show you Isaiah 40 through 66 from our friends. Oh, I didn't even click that for Isaiah. Whoops, I see. Look at I'm doing it wrong already. Isaiah 40 through 66. So push that up there. There we go. Now I got it right. Isaiah 40 through 66. That way, if you're following along or whenever you get on this, you know where we're at when it comes to our Bible binge. And next up, we're going to dig into that Bible Project video, looking at this section of some really familiar prophecies and passages. And even though it's beautiful poetry that can be difficult to understand, you'll see some encouraging words in the midst of the journey that you're on today. So here we go. Chapter 40.
The book of the prophet Isaiah. In the first video, we explored chapters 1 to 39, which was Isaiah's message of judgment and hope for Jerusalem. He accused Israel's leaders of rebellion against God and said that through Assyria and then Babylon, Israel's kingdom would come crashing down in an act of God's judgment. And so chapter 39 concluded with Isaiah predicting Jerusalem's fall to Babylon in the exile. And 100 years after Isaiah, it all sadly came to pass. But Isaiah's greater hope was for a new, purified Jerusalem, where God's kingdom would be restored through the future Messianic king, and all nations would come together in peace. And so chapters 40 and following explore this great hope. The first main section, chapters 40 to 48, open with an announcement of hope and comfort for Israel. The people are told that the Babylonian exile is over and that Israel's sin has been dealt with, a new era is beginning. So they should all return home to Jerusalem, where God himself will bring his kingdom and all nations will see his glory. Now, let's stop for a moment because this opening announcement raises a big question. That is, who is saying all of this? Whose voice are we hearing in these words of hope? The perspective of the prophet in these chapters is that of somebody who's living after the exile, in other words, in the time period described by Ezra and Nehemiah. But Isaiah died 150 years before any of that. So what are we supposed to make of this? Well, there are many who think that it's still Isaiah in his own day speaking, but that he's been prophetically transported, so to speak, 200 years into the future, and that he's speaking to future generations as if the exile is past. However, the book of Isaiah itself gives us some clues that something else is probably going on. In chapters 8 and 29 and 30, we're told that after Isaiah was rejected by Israel's leaders, that he wrote and sealed up in a scroll all of his messages of judgment and hope, and that he passed it on to his disciples as a witness for days to come. Eventually, Isaiah died, waiting for God to vindicate his words. Now remember, chapters 1 to 39 were designed to show us that Isaiah's predictions of judgment were fulfilled in the exile. He's a true prophet. And so after exile is over, Isaiah's disciples, who have treasured his words for so long, open up the scroll and begin applying his words of hope to their own day. So on this view, the book of Isaiah consists of that first collection of Isaiah's words, as well as the writings of his prophetic disciples that God uses to extend Isaiah's message of hope to future generations. Whichever view you end up taking, everybody agrees that these chapters are announcing that the future hope has come, that God is fulfilling Isaiah's prophetic promises. And so the prophet hopes that Israel will respond by becoming God's servant. That is, after experiencing God's justice and mercy through history, that they will now begin to share with the nations who God truly is. But that's not what's happening. Israel, instead of bearing witness to the nations, is actually complaining and even accusing God. They say, the Lord doesn't pay attention to our trouble. In fact, he's ignoring our cause. The Babylonian exile, understandably, caused Israel to lose faith in their God. I mean, maybe he's not that powerful. Maybe the gods of Babylon are way greater than our God. And so the rest of these chapters, 41 to 47, are set up like a trial scene. God is responding to these doubts and accusations with the following arguments. He says first that the exile to Babylon was not divine neglect. Rather, it was divinely orchestrated as a judgment for Israel's sin. And second, it was for Israel's sake that God raised up Persia to conquer Babylon so they could come back home, fulfilling Isaiah's words. So the right conclusion that Israel should draw is that their God is the king of history, not the idols of the nations. In the fall of Babylon and the rise of the Persian king Cyrus, Israel should see God's hand at work and so become his servant, telling the nations who he is. But by the end of the trial, chapter 48, we find that Israel is still as rebellious and hard-hearted as their ancestors. And so God disqualifies them as his servant, but God still is on a mission to bless the nations. And so the prophet says God's going to do a new thing to solve this problem, which moves into the next section, 49 to 55. We're introduced to a figure who's called God's servant, who's going to fulfill God's mission and do what Israel has failed to do. God gives this servant the title Israel and sends this person on a mission to, first of all, restore the people of Israel back to their God, but second, to become God's light to the nations. And we're told that this servant is empowered by God's Spirit to announce good news and to bring God's kingdom over all of the nations. It sounds just like the Messianic king from chapters 9 and 11. But then we learn the surprising way of how the servant will bring God's kingdom. He's going to be rejected and beaten and ultimately killed by his own people. In reality, as he's being accused and sentenced to death, he's dying on behalf of the sin of his own people. The prophet says the servant's death is a sacrifice of atonement for the people's evil and rebellion. And then, after his death, all of a sudden, the servant is just alive again. And we hear that by his death, he provided a way to make people righteous. That is, to put them in a right relationship with God. And so the section concludes by describing two ways people can respond to the servant. Some will respond with humility and turn from their sins and accept what God's servant did on their behalf. These people are called the servants and also the seed. Remember the holy seed from chapter 6. These are the ones who will experience the blessing of the Messianic kingdom. But there are others who are called simply the wicked, and they reject both the servant and his servants, which brings us to the final section of the book, 56 to 66, where the servants inherit God's kingdom. These chapters are beautifully designed as a symmetry that brings together all of the themes of the book. At the very center are three beautiful poems that describe how the Spirit-empowered servant is announcing the good news of God's kingdom to the poor, and he reaffirms all of the promises of hope from earlier in the book. The New Jerusalem, inhabited by God's servants, will be the place from which God's justice and mercy and blessing flow out to all the nations of the world. And surrounding these poems are two long prayers of repentance, where the servants confess Israel's sin, and they grieve over all of the evil they see in the world around them. And so they ask God to forgive them, and that his kingdom would come here on earth as it is in heaven. Now, on each side of these prayers are collections of more poems that contrast the destiny of the servants with that of the wicked who persecute them. God says he's going to bring his justice on all who pollute his good world with their evil and selfishness and idolatry, and that he's going to remove them from his city forever. But the servants, those who are humble before God and who repent and own their evil, they are forgiven, and they will inherit the new Jerusalem, which, we discover, is an image for an entirely renewed creation, where death and suffering are gone forever. And this brings us to the very outer frame of this part of the book. In this renewed world of God's kingdom, people from all nations are invited to come and join the servants of God's covenant family so that everyone can know their Creator and Redeemer. And so the book of Isaiah ends with the very grand vision of the fulfillment of all of God's covenant promises. Through the suffering servant king, God creates a covenant family of all nations who are awaiting the hope of God's justice in bringing a renewed creation, where God's kingdom finally comes here on earth as it is in heaven. And that's the very powerful hope of the book of Isaiah.
So that's what you got coming ahead for you for the second half of Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 66. There's some really familiar passages that come up in here. There's some comforting ones. I mean, I was looking through as the video was going. Some of my favorite ones are coming up. I'm looking at Isaiah, where is it? I just marked it down, but then I changed my page. Isaiah 49. Oh my gosh, Isaiah 49, verse 15. That says, "Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she would have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. Behold, I have engraved you on the palm of my hands. Your walls are continually before me." It's a comfort that Isaiah is bringing to Jerusalem. God hasn't forgotten you. He can't forget you. You're engraved on the palm of his hands. He sees you always. And the analogy he uses is a woman caring for her child. She's going to care for him. But even these may forget that. And we see in the sinful world that does happen. But God says, "I'm not going to forget you." And I love this passage. This one's especially comforting to me in a time and age where we have so many people that live to a ripe old age but can forget at times and lose their memories with Alzheimer's and other diseases, and they may forget who even they are. But God doesn't. God does not forget who they are. He's washed them and redeemed them in the waters of their baptism. He's fed them with his son's very body and blood. He cannot forget them, and that's such great comfort to us as well. And Israel's going to need that comfort because they're going to get confused. They're going to think about the Babylonian captivity, Isaiah says, as God forgetting them, but we instead, if you read the first 39 chapters, you realize it's divine judgment for their sin and their rebellion and their rejecting of God. But yet, when God carries out that punishment, they have a hard time understanding it, and just like we do as well. So my prayer is that as you read through that book of Isaiah, that you dig deep into that word, you hear some of the echoes of some great hymns and songs and chorals that are based on this, and especially as you read about the suffering servants, and you realize the surprising way. And I mentioned that a little bit this weekend. We have God coming as our conquering king, intervening for Hezekiah, killing 18,500 troops, or 185,000, there it is, 185,000 troops against the king of Assyria, and intervening for Hezekiah. But he's not always a God of power and might. He's also that suffering servant who knows our griefs and carried our sorrows. So when you come to him in prayer, know you're coming to Jesus who understands and gets you. He's not distant and far off. He's near, and he will not forget you. He's engraved you on the palm of his hands, and hands that still bear the marks of those nails that he went to the cross to endure for you and arise victoriously from the grave, so that one day you too may rise as well. There's a way we can help you in this journey. Please let me know. We got groups meeting. I know we got 2 different Tuesday Bible study groups meeting off campus and both on campus. We got men's group meeting at noon on Wednesday. I know Women of Joy meeting together Thursday night at Longhorn Cattle Company there in San Benito in the evening, and of course Bible study on Sunday morning, and we got grief share going on as well as a supplemental to these times we're going through this Bible binge. We're 10 months in, so we only got 4 months left, so there's still a great time to get started. We're going to be in Isaiah this week and a little bit into next week, and then Jeremiah is following that up, and Jeremiah, again, some of the same stuff we'll see, same themes, another major prophet, but we'll talk more about that in the coming days, especially to read these passages in the context that they're given. So that's an important thing too. Let me know what your favorite passage is as you come along and read this book of Isaiah. It's hard to pick one, but I shared one of mine there with you from Isaiah 49, verse Verse 15, Isaiah 49:15, God's memory is never failing for you, and he knows you, he remembers you, he calls you by name, and one day he will call you home face to face to be with him for all eternity in that banqueting feast that will never end.